All right, and welcome to number 20 of the Jazz Sessions. This will be our second of four sessions on making story models. Today we're going to be talking about people, places, and plots. And we might find that this is a short one. Again, hard to tell. Next week I am very certain will be a long one, but this might be a short one. It was not a convenient breaking place between the two of them. So we will be going in and looking at ways to model the things that make up the story. But first,
And for what? For a little bit of money. There's more to life than a little money, you know.
as you regulars know, I'm doing this because I love to share. And if I make a little money, that's a side issue. But I would certainly like to interest you in some of my books. On the right, of course, Making Story Models is the book that these 4 weeks are drawn from. And if you want to get deeper coverage of the topic, follow that QR code to see lots more examples and lots more thought behind the examples. Over here on the left for this week, I decided to dig back to one of my older collections. This is a short story collection, Family Secrets. It contains my very first Writers of the Future story, which was a finalist, The Mother Anthony, which is a story of a teacher with her students on a starship that suffers a disaster along the way, and they have to find a way to survive this disaster and keep the spirits up and keep the family safe and get everybody through what's going to be one very long diversion. Also in that book is a story called One Last Chore for Grandpa. It was I believe that was a finalist. Yes, that was the finalist. That was in fact, the finalist that was Katie Wentworth's very last story that she judged as the coordinating judge for Writers Future before sadly she passed away. That was the quarter where she was literally judging while the workshop and the gala was going on, and all of her friends were being very quiet about this. And Joni had to try to keep up spirits at the workshop as her friend is in the hospital passing away. And the whole time, still trying to do the judging of the contest. And this story, she turned into Joni as a finalist before she passed away. Joni calls me to let me know my story's a finalist because that's how it works, but not telling me that we've lost KD. And the next morning, I'm like waiting to find, have they announced all the finalists yet? And I learned that KD's gone. And through the grapevine and through channels, I start realizing nobody else got their stories announced at all. And one of the rules of finalists is you don't say who you are until they all get officially announced. And so I now put myself in a mode where, well, I don't have to worry. I know my results. But now everybody in the forum is hurting because some of us knew Katie really well. Some of us, like me, only knew her through the contest and through her judging. But we felt like this was a person who was part of our lives, and we just lost her. And I felt like my job now is to be the one uplifting spirits as we go through a long process of grieving. That I have to be the one who tries to keep everybody focused, keep everybody writing, keep everybody together as a community, because I don't have quite the same stake. I'm now at a point where, okay, I know what my results were. I can concentrate on them as we go through the long process of getting Dave up to speed as the new coordinating judge. He had been in the past, so this was not something that was completely new to him, but he was essentially picking up almost from ground zero. I did not win that quarter, But I am very proud of what we did as a community to remember KD, raising funds for cancer research, and what we did to stick together and get through that together. So this story was the last one KD judged. It is about a young man who grew up in Haiti in the traditional Haitian tradition of voodoo and the Bokor, and grew up in a family that was falling apart. The only stability he had was his grandfather. And then he was taken by his American father back to New York City after the marriage fell apart, where he went to school and became a lawyer. And then the earthquake hit Haiti. And a little reality suddenly intrudes on the story that he went back to Haiti to try to help in the relief effort there and managed to see just how hard the country was hit and did everything he could, helping with his father beside him, trying to help rebuild things. And when he came back, goes back to law school, then he gets a call from his mother that his grandfather has died, or mail from his mother. His grandfather has died and has been taken by the Bokor, and he has to go back to Haiti one more time at a point in life where he's accepted that all that voodoo he experienced as a child, that wasn't real. That was his childish imagination. And now he has to confront it face to face. So that's the second story that's in there. The third story is one I don't share with certain people, people you might call mothers, but not just mothers, mothers with ill children. They're not allowed to read Mama's Little Help or Mama's Little Angel, because it is a story about a mother who takes her son to the hospital, and what she discovers threatens her sanity. It is so much beyond what she had ever imagined. So, this is one of my shorter collections, which means it is a small price to pick up, especially an ebook. Um, it is one that I just, in fact, very recently did not give a mother who was going through her situation with her child with cancer. So it was on my mind this week when I was thinking, what should I promote? Well, I didn't give her one, but it wouldn't hurt my feelings if I sold one to somebody. So that's our paying for the soup. Now we're going to talk about, for those of you who've been here a while, the concept of tools, not rules. If somebody is telling you the rules to write, they're wrong. They can teach you tools for writing, but every tool has exceptions. As Goldman told us, nobody knows anything. Now, he was talking about movie making, but it is just as true about writing. Not one person in the motion picture field knows for certainty what's going to work, because if they knew, everything would be a top selling hit all the time. It's all applying the tools you have and seeing what works. Even if I call something a rule, it's going to be a tool. I will sometimes speak a little bombastically, but no, I'm not telling rules. I am, excuse me, teaching tools. So with that out of the way, when last we left our intrepid band of adventurers, we were here last week talking about story modeling, introducing some principles, and also then introducing goal diagrams where you show what your characters are, what their goals are, motivations behind those goals, and how they participate in those goals with other characters who might be contributors or might be detractors. In odd cases, might be both. Do we have any questions from last week, or did anybody do some experiment with it that they'd like to discuss?
Is there a
Nothing?
recording of it that we could see later?
There is definitely recording of every session. That QR code that was on the first, not on the first slide, but at the title slide, will take you to my page with the recordings of all of the jazz sessions. So absolutely feel free to go look at those and share with your friends if you find something useful, because I want these to be things that everybody has access to and can learn from. And yes, David has the story models. Yes, going to send links. So yes, the recordings are definitely out there for everybody who has a need for them. All right, so if we got no questions from last week, I want to pick up almost exactly where we left off. Come on. So last week we took our goal diagram, which was Superman wanting to deliver a story to Perry, with Jimmy contributing photographs and Superman ultimately submitting the story to Perry. And I added on two objects onto this diagram. I added on the photographs that become part of the story and the story that we create and submit to Perry. Now, we are basing this notation off the unified modeling language for software. So the shapes that you're seeing are shapes I chose arbitrarily. Somebody else chose them arbitrarily a long time ago, and I could get into the history of who that somebody else was, but you really don't need to know. Just that the idea is a bubble is a goal or an action. A box is a thing within the story. So the photographs, the stories, a car, a gun, a place. We draw these objects and add them to the goal diagrams to show the inputs and outputs to the process. So we have an arrow from the object that's being used, photographs, to the goal of delivering the story. We also have objects, arrows coming out from deliver the story to Perry to the actual story object. So incoming arrows means we're using this. Outgoing arrows means we're producing or sending out this. Now, as I mentioned last week, you'll notice that the arrows are funky arrows with dashed lines. I don't care if your arrows have dashed lines or not. I could get into a long discussion of why they are dashed lines. The biggest reason for me is the other arrows represent characters doing specific things. Photograph isn't something that you do. Photograph is something you use. Story isn't something you do, it's something you create. So a different arrow for that type. If you don't use the right arrows, nobody's going to beat down your door and say, hey, you're breaking the rules of UML, so we've got to lock you up. But now that we have the concept of objects, we can actually connect our characters directly to objects. So now we have Superman writes the story. We have Jimmy snaps the photographs. So this is now a whole separate relationship from the goal. And in some ways, this is simpler because we're not really thinking so much about the goals. They're a separate relationship. That if we took that goal off this picture and just said Superman writes stories and Jimmy snaps photographs, it's like, yeah, those are things that each of these characters works with in their daily work. So adding those arrows in now draws a connection from a character to something they use or work with. But now we've introduced the concept of relating things. Things can be related to other things. And we've just taken goals and characters completely out. And now we are creating object diagrams. So the arrow is kind of a direction of the relationship. So the arrow goes from photograph to story because photographs illustrate a story. This is such a simple example that you would never draw this picture. I would never draw this picture. But it's a starting point for pictures that might be more useful and that we might draw. But let's keep in mind that relationship and look at it again. Now here, instead of saying photograph illustrates stories, we say a story has photographs, and that's why the arrow is reversed. Often it's just a matter of how you think of it in your head. If you're the photographer, You probably think of the photographs first and that they illustrate a story. If you're the reporter, you probably think of the story first and that it has photographs. It is functionally the same thing. It's just a matter of perspective. But now we can start adding to our notation. We can start being very specific, particularly adding counts in. So our top diagram here says that this story has 5 photographs. We put the number at the end of the line, 5 photographs. And then the bottom one says this story has 0 photographs. This is not an illustrated story. This is a story that we're not leaving it vague. We're not saying it could or might not have photographs. By sticking the 0 on there, we have specifically said it might have had photographs, but it does not. But then we can play with object counts a little more. Because what sort of newspaper says every story has 5 photographs or 3? Well, sometimes you get in newsletters that there's a defined template that is like one of the ones on my mailing list program has a template that says you are going to have 3 photographs in here. And if you try to not have 3 photographs, we're going to make it really hard for you because you chose the easy button. And our easy button assumes you're going to have 3 photographs. But if it's going to be an unknown number, you just use the asterisk to say it's going to have some number of photographs. Or, as in the second example here, 0 ... some number. Why is that important? Because, okay, I, as an engineer slash programmer, if you say some number, intuitively I know that means 0, because 0 is some number, is one possibility. But you'd be amazed how many times we programmers go to design a system and somebody will tell us this has some number of things attached to it. And then when they attach 0 things to it, something blows up because nobody ever considered the 0 case. They assumed there would always be at least 1 photograph. And it's like, no, sometimes there isn't. What's going to happen to your code when there's 0 photographs? So by putting the 0 ... star as opposed to just star, I'm explicitly saying, hey, don't forget the 0 case. And the bottom one is saying, this might be, again, a case of an example of a template. Our template allows anywhere from 0 to 5 photographs, but you're not going to have more. So adding these numbers on lets you be a little more specific about how the system works. And we'll get into a couple of examples where it's a little more important. In the newspaper example, okay, in a true newspaper, your number of stories is the number you need. The publisher is caught in a battle because pictures sell newspapers, but too many pictures becomes expensive to print. So they're constantly back and forth in tension of, I need all the good pictures you can give me and don't give me dumb ones. But the idea of photograph counting isn't as important as some other counts we'll have coming up. Now that we have this concept of objects and counts and relationships, we start getting into useful diagrams, ones I'm actually likely to draw. These here, I'm not drawing that. I'm going to say stories can have any number of photographs, including 0. I'm going to put it into words. But as it gets to be a more complex problem domain, I am likely to create pictures of how things are related. So this is a picture of, and it's already out of date because as has happened to a lot of newspapers, my local newspaper has gotten smaller still through the years. But this is the picture when I wrote this originally that my newspaper had 4 sections. Now, it might be less, it might be 1 to 4, but it traditionally was 4 sections. A section has some number of pages. You can't have a section with 0 pages. If you actually get into the newspaper publishing business, you realize it gets more complicated than that. because the number of pages in a section must be a multiple of 4 because of how it's constructed, because it really is just one big sheet with folded in the middle, and then the fold outside the fold is 1 page, outside the other side of the fold is 1 page, inside the fold is 2 more pages. So really specifically, it needs to be not just 1 to star, but it needs to be 1 to a multiple of 4. That's more detailed notation than I cared about for this example. But a section at least has a page. A page has 0 or more advertisements. And if you've worked in that newspaper business, you realize that's the most important part of this whole diagram, because that's what pays the bills. All the rest of this stuff costs you money, but doesn't make you any money. The advertisements are what pays for everything else here. So you better not leave the advertisements off of your visual glossary of the newspaper business. So a page might have advertisements. And as you go through the newspaper business, you start finding really fast that anything but the front page probably has an advertisement on it somewhere. Front page and editorial page, probably not, but they'll sneak them in anywhere else they can, because again, that's where the money is. For my book, Ula, Martian Song, book 1, I did a lot of research into 1907 newspapers in the Grand Rapids area where my story was set. And I was just surprised to discover that you'll get, in those old papers, you'd get advertisements even on the front page. It was a different business model then, that they weren't trying to be quite so much the splashy, attention-grabbing front page. It was just part of the regular presentation of information. But today, I can't remember seeing an advertisement on a front page in the last 40 years. I can't remember spending serious time with a newspaper in the last 10, so maybe somebody's doing it again. The other interesting thing about that, side note, nothing to do with the model, but just I found it curious. Today, our newspapers are pretty much laid out in rectangular blocks. So a story might be 3 columns wide and 5 inches high. And a story next to it might be 3 columns wide and 5 inches high, because maybe it's 6 columns are what's laid out in that paper. Back in that 1907 newspaper, a story started at the top of a column and went all the way down to the bottom. And if the story hadn't finished yet, it started up on the next column and went all the way down. But if a story stopped in the middle, the next one started. So it was really kind of, you were reading down the column, read down the next column, read down the next, and so on. And I am curious, not curious enough that I've done the research on it yet, but curious when that changed from the normal way of processing to where now our blocks are the normal way. But that's a side note. So, meanwhile, notice I've added numbers on both ends of the arrows in some cases here. So a page has 0 or more advertisements, but notice that I also say, and an advertisement requires 1 or 2 pages. It's generally going to be an advertisement is found on exactly 1 page, but if it's a big double page ad that they paid through the nose for, it might be 2 pages. Meanwhile, a page has 0 or more stories on it. Not every page has stories. Some are nothing but ads. And vice versa, a story appears on at least 1 page, but may be spread across multiple pages. And in fact, you may even have the old traditional, this story continues on page C3. And so you turn to the 3rd page of section C to find that. And then a story has 0 or more photographs. So this is where we start having useful documentation of the problem domain. It's not an everything diagram yet. I could easily turn this into an everything diagram, but it's not yet. For those who weren't here last week, the everything diagram is a diagram with so much stuff on it that you get lost trying to read it, and it becomes less helpful than no diagram at all. the answer to everything diagrams is you turn things into smaller sub-diagrams. This I wouldn't consider an everything diagram. To me, it's a glossary. It's a quick, in one glance, picture of how all the pieces of the newspaper relate to each other. And there's information behind that there's information about a page, such as how big is it? How many columns wide is it? Where does it appear within the section? There's all sorts of information beyond this picture, but this is kind of an overview, a way of looking at what you might almost call a map, and we'll be talking about maps later. This is sort of a map of what goes into a newspaper. Questions on visual glossaries? No question? All right. And then we can go right back to having characters on our visual glossary. Start exploring how the characters relate to the parts. So the publisher publishes the newspaper, which has sections, and the managing editor is deciding what those sections are going to be. That is the person who is designing the paper for the publisher. And then the page is laid out by a layout manager who has to lay out the page, lay out the advertisements, lay out the story, and then along comes some schmuck writer who produces a story that's too long, or even worse, too short, and now you've got to relay out everything. Advertisements have to be submitted or placed by the customer and approved by the ad manager. Meanwhile, stories are written by reporters, photographers snap the photos, and a section editor will be assigning and approving stories for their section and assigning and approving photographs. And all of a sudden, I now have a working model of what a newspaper looked like. Again, past tense, because I'm not sure what they look like in the modern digital age when they've lost so many people and they've gotten so much smaller. But this is the concept of a newspaper I grew up with. This was a way to understand how parts relate. So if you're telling a story about the newspaper business, you are probably, if you're looking for a typical action thriller, you are probably writing about the reporter or maybe the photographer. But you now understand that both of them answer to a section editor. You know that both of them answer to some degree to the layout manager, because the layout manager is going to decide what there's room for. So that photographer gets 3 fantastic shots of the car going off the bridge. The layout manager may say, we only have room for 2, so pick one. Pick the one you want to get rid of. They understand, ultimately, if you trace through this, that those 2 may have to fight with the publisher, because the publisher is ultimately trying to make money with this, and they're trying to tell a story. And those 2 don't always agree. Classic newspaper story conflict is, this story is going to make a customer for the advertisements look bad. And the customer may decide to pull their ad, which takes all sorts of money out of the newspaper, which means the ad manager is now running to the publisher and screaming, you can't let them do this. And the reporter and the photographer are going to their section editor and saying, protect the integrity of our story. And the layout manager really doesn't have a stake in this other than waiting for people to make up their minds, because this paper has to go to press in the next 15 minutes, so somebody make a decision. All of a sudden, this is the landscape that newspaper story happens in. And by documenting the landscape, it starts giving you ways you can think about conflicts that otherwise you might have missed. The idea that the reporter and the photographer are coming up with a dangerous, risk-taking story, that's a legitimate story trope. But now when we see this concept of the whole domain, we start seeing specific ways that they could run into conflicts. And this is just within the domain. Now we haven't gotten into, oh, the people shooting at them for trying to investigate their crimes and so on. So questions on the visual glossary now. All right. Again, it might be overkill for your project, but it is a useful way of sort of mapping out elements of your world building. And if your world building is complex, I don't think it's overkill at all. If I'm telling a story about a person trying to get across country on a bus because their car is broken down and they need to be in Chicago by tomorrow morning, whatever it takes, I don't necessarily need to build a model of the bus company. But if I am building a story about the bus company, which suddenly finds that they're the only form of transportation that's operating for some odd reason, that things have shut down and they're the only ones getting through, I might actually have to start thinking, what does the bus company have? They have buses, they have routes, they have drivers, they have dispatchers, they have people who are in charge of accounting because somebody's got to buy the gas and so on and so on. I might need to, for the important parts of my story, I might need to go in and build a visual glossary on here. My stories are often in the realm of space travel and space colonies and so on. And I might have to go in and really see how these pieces tie together. And I'll draw out a picture for that. And we'll see some examples of those coming up. All right. Now, last week we talked about adding traits to a character. Okay, here's the sneaky little secret. If boxes are things, aren't people under the general category of things? If you go and look at the definition, the dictionary definition of thing, living things are things. They're a category of thing, but living things are things. When you look at what goes into your model under the hood, just like we can add traits like your address and your height and your name and so on to a character, you can add traits and functions to objects in general. So how do you tell one gun apart from another? Well, make and model, and the type, and the manufacturer, and the caliber. These traits help describe how it differs from other similar objects. And then underneath the traits, we have functions. So putting the safety on, taking it off, loading and unloading, firing. And we even have functions that aren't things you want to do, but can happen, like jamming. Jamming is a function that a gun can do in a story. It becomes, in fact, a very useful thing if your fight is going too well and you need to complicate things. Having a convenient but explained jam can really help you make your protagonists have to now defend themselves some other way or dive for cover and so on. So some of the functions are things you do with it, and some of the functions are just automatic. Again, you focus on what's important to your story, and you focus on the ones that are useful in your story, but that could actually differ from the particular kind of story you're telling. When I am telling a story, I virtually never pay attention to these because I am generally not doing a lot of fighting in my stories. When I am, it's a gun. It fires bullets at a distance. Things go bang, bang. That's all it is. If I'm writing a thriller, an espionage thriller, or a military science fiction story, or one of Larry Correia's Monster Hunter books, where the fans are heavily into the details of the weaponry, then I would potentially go and add all of this into my description of a particular gun. But in fact, I might even go farther. Because remember, we had our visual glossary. We can have visual glossary of just the parts of something. We can do a little glossary of the related objects in one larger object. So, again, I wouldn't do this in a general case, but I could do this from the descriptions in Korea's Monster Hunter books, where there's a lot of customized weaponry. I could actually document the customized weaponry with an object diagram like this. So, in this version of the picture, this version, come on, we just say that a gun has a certain number of rounds and a capacity in it. So capacity is what you can put in it, rounds is what's left. In this picture, a gun has a magazine or not. Notice the 0 or 1. So if the magazine is ejected, currently that gun has no magazine. The magazine that it has, if it has one, has a capacity, which is how many rounds can you put in it. It has a caliber, which is what kind of rounds you can put into it, and a configuration. There are, I'm stretching the limits of my gun knowledge here, but there are certainly what they call single stack and double stack. Essentially, a single stack is all the bullets are lined up vertically. In a double stack, if I'm getting that term right, the bullets are kind of side by side in a diagonal pattern, and as they come up, the diagonal back and forth comes in and fills in this place for the next one up. Some of the functions of the magazine is you can load and unload the magazine. This is not loading it into the gun, where we have that over on the gun. We have load magazine and eject magazine. This is loading rounds into the magazine. And a magazine has a capacity, and then it has a number of rounds in it. And notice how I specified that number of rounds is anything from 0, an empty magazine, all the way up to the capacity of that magazine. But you won't put more than that in, or you're going to have yourself a jamming gun. A round has a caliber. It has what sort of jacket it has on it, which matters to the aficionados, but I don't really keep them straight. It has a point, because sometimes you have hollow points. It has a load, which is how much actual powder, propellant, is in that cartridge. And then the gun itself, an important point, really, really important in action stories. Is there one round already in the chamber or not? Because if there is not a round in the chamber, then before you can attack that monster that surprises you and jumps out at you, you have to actually load one round from the magazine into the chamber. So knowing that will affect the pacing of your fight scenes. Meanwhile, our gun, again, manufacturer, make, model, type, caliber, is the safety on? Is it in working condition? Because over the course of an action movie or action book, often guns get damaged, guns get dirty, guns need cleaning. And so you have to be able to know if this gun is in working condition or not. Also, a gun has 0 or 1 sights on it, where a sight has manufacturer, make, model, minimum, maximum magnification, adjustments that you can make because you know how far away it is and how high the wind is blowing, other special features and functions you can do on it. Now, that is a lot more model than I am going to build for one of my stories, where the most action-oriented story I have written had a lot of gunshots for me. I don't remember now. It's been a long time since I wrote that one, but it might have been 10 or 12 shots fired. I might have actually had to get into some of this amount of detail, but for mine, it's generally not important. You start getting into the classic Dirty Harry, how many shots do I have left scene? You start worrying about a lot more details like this. Questions on the related objects. Okay. Now, and we are still doing pretty well on our time here. Now I'm going to step a little bit away from things, from people and objects, and start relating them to plot. Objects and goals, relating them to plot. So, A plotting diagram just says, here's the steps I'm going to do to try to accomplish my goal. And you can keep it really simple. If my goal is submit a story to Perry, then my plotting diagram says, and I submit the story. That is really boring. And you know what? Really boring is great for some stories. If your story is about all the things Superman has to go through during his day as he tries to stop the asteroid from hitting the Earth, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on him submitting that story. Unless the asteroid's really slow and a long ways away and he has time, we're not going to devote pages and panels to this. But if the comic book story that we're writing is about how he puts that story together to finally hand it over to Perry, then we might turn it into an actual useful diagram where Superman, his goal is he wants to submit the story. And he is a responsible reporter, so he's going to check with his sources. He's going to send Jimmy out, go get me photographs. He's going to write a draft, and then because he's really a responsible reporter, he's going to take that draft back to the sources and confirm with them. This is what I think you told me. Is this really what you told me? And he's getting the photos from Jimmy, and he's going to submit that draft to Perry. And Perry, because Perry is a perfectionist and nothing's ever good enough for Perry the first time, Perry sends back revision notes, and he sends the revisions to Perry, and the story is submitted. Story-wise, both of these end at the same point, but they are two immediately different stories because the top diagram, submitting the story, is a step along a path, a step along the plot. In the bottom, submitting that story is the plot. And we've broken it down into smaller details. You remember last time we talked about adding points into a goal, into the bubble. And I said, there's another way to do this. This is the other way to do this, to produce these actual steps inside of a plotting diagram. Now, at this point, you are probably looking and saying, couldn't I just write these down in a bulleted list? Yes, you could. And there's no reason why you can't. But I'm going to be talking about things you can do that are easier in a graphical presentation than in a list presentation. Part of which is the Murphy game. If you're familiar with Murphy's Law, whatever can go wrong will go wrong. You, as the person plotting the story, one of your great tools is Murphy's Law in the Murphy game. If you want to make a more complex story, you take that original diagram and you look at every step and say, what could go wrong? And if the answer is nothing, maybe skip that step. Don't bother talking about it. If nothing could go wrong, you don't need it for the story. You don't need it for the plot. It's if nothing could go wrong, then this is a case where tell, don't show. If nothing could go wrong, then you don't need to spend time on it. But if something could go wrong, that's a Murphy point. Ask what could go wrong and what do the characters do afterwards. And does this let you get back to the original plan? Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes if you follow a Murphy path, you cannot ever get back to the original path because now you've broken something. Your plan to follow the Murphy path ends up with, oh, and by the way, that building I was going back to burned down on this path. I can't go back there. We're on a different path. The examples we're going to show are going to be ones, however, where there is always a way back. But we're, in the meantime, going to say, what could go wrong? What is more interesting about this? So, Superman's got a story, and the sources are going to tell him important information about crime in the city. And when he tries to check with the sources, he can't find them. They've gone into hiding. If the sources have, let's reduce it to keep it simple for focus on a story. It's one source that Superman cannot find, even with all of his superpowers. He can't find it, so he has to go searching. And when he finds that source, then he can send Jimmy out for the photos and follow the rest of the path. That's assuming he can find that source. But we can complicate things further, and this is actually a much more complicated version. We'll talk about how we got here. So He searched for the source, and even with his super senses, he couldn't find this source. Someone is hiding this source and hiding it hard. And so what he needs is the world's greatest detective, aka Bruce Wayne, aka Batman. So he said, Bruce, find me this guy. And Bruce finds him, and we're back to the original path. Okay. Slight complication, but it's not really yet an exciting story. But suppose when he goes to call Bruce, by a coincidence, Bruce isn't in Gotham City where he's trying to track Superman's trying to track him down. He's actually come to Metropolis for a case. So now Superman's going to suit up and go search Metropolis for Bruce, and he finds Bruce, and Bruce finds the source, and we're done. No, 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 no. We want more complicated than that yet. When he finds Bruce, Batman is in battle with Luthor's goons. So they can team up because there's nothing fans love more than a team up in the comics. So he teams up with Batman to fight Luthor's goons. They defeat the goons and thus finds the clue to the source. And we find the source and we're back in the original path. Okay. I think this can still be a more interesting plot. Yes, we're trying to fight the goons, but Luthor has equipped them with super weapons. And they actually defeat Superman and Batman and they get away. So now the world's greatest detective search for clues, and they're going to track the goons to the lair. And when they get to the lair, they're going to fight Luthor and the goons and the giant robots and rescue the source, and they're back to the original plot. Or the goons are using the super weapons again. Because after all, once you've introduced them in, it's sort of a Chekhov super weapon. Once you hang that super weapon on the wall, you better use it. But they use the super weapons, and this time Superman and Batman are ready for them with something that happened way more times in the 50s and 60s than ever should have happened. It was a common trope in the comics, the old switcheroo. They're using the sonic blaster on Batman and the kryptonite ray on Superman, except Superman is actually Batman who is wearing Superman's costume, and Batman is Superman. So they're using the super weapons on the wrong targets and therefore get defeated. So now we can rescue the source, and now we can send Jimmy out for photos. And suddenly we have taken that original linear plot and we have Murphy'd the heck out of it. And in the process, we have built ourselves a story. Not the most original story. I've read variations of this story for the past 60 years or more, but it is much more useful than the original. The original simple linear plot was just to get us places to start looking for Murphy points. Now we could look at Murphy points again. We probably aren't going to see any failure that can go on with writing the draft because Superman, also known as Clark Kent, is a very professional writer. I don't think he's going to have any problem writing the draft. But we could have all sorts of things that happen when he goes to confirm the sources. Maybe while this was all happening, Jimmy got himself kidnapped. So getting the photos from Jimmy involves a rescue mission. Submitting the draft to Perry and getting the revision notes, those aren't going to be very superhero stuff. So we're probably done from there. By putting the thing down in a graphical form, and this is where, again, a good tool makes it easier. But you can do this just as well with sticky notes on a whiteboard. Moving the things around, redrawing connectors. You can take the simple original plot and turn it into things that make sense within the context of your story, but take the simple linear and turn it into a Murphy path or multiple Murphy paths. Now, while I'm here, because you know I digress, and I digress, I mentioned sticky notes on a whiteboard. I probably have mentioned this before, but I'm going to mention it again. If you're going to buy sticky notes, I know budget is important, but buy actual 3M Post-it notes. Don't buy the cheapest sticky notes you can find in the stationery store, because in my experience, having used sticky notes to teach modeling to programmers for many, many, many years, what we learned is a 3M Post-it note can be unstuck and restuck somewhere else somewhere between 6 and 7 times, unless the thing you're sticking it to is really dirty. So clean your whiteboard. The average cheap bargain sticky note, if you're lucky, can be restuck once before it falls off. And we eventually stop trying to economize on our sticky notes. We will pay 3M for the quality adhesive. Now, that's neither here nor there. I, again, use the tool to draw these, so I'm not doing sticky notes anymore unless I'm doing it for a public presentation. Questions on the Murphy game? This is
Hey, great,
also,
Martin. Thanks for explaining that. It's sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it's just a great breakdown on how um, if nothing can go wrong, take it out. It's just it's something extra, and it's probably one of the things I do wrong most. Just because it just seems good to me while I'm writing it, but as you talked it out, I found in my own head the story I'm working on right now, like 4 or 5 things I can just drop right now because it's just extra kind of fluff.
yep. And if nothing's going wrong, you can tell it. Concentrate the writing on the things that go wrong. I have another longer workshop that maybe I'll get to here at some point, which was a mystery workshop. And one of the mysteries I use as my example is one of my favorite movies, which is Beverly Hills Cop, which satisfies most of the requirements to make a really good mystery, except for one thing. This, different bubbles, but this is essentially the diagram of Beverly Hills Cop. At every single step along the way, the only thing that can happen next is the thing that happens next. There's no places where things can really go wrong. Everything just follows a very linear path because that movie wasn't about really complex plot. That movie was about we want to give Eddie Murphy as much improv time on screen as possible while having lots of gunfights and lots of action and chase scenes and so on. So we're not trying to do complexity. We're trying to get action and humor. I have got a version in there where I took the Beverly Hills Cop plot and turned it into an entirely different plot, starting with the same elements and simply working with my students and saying, what could have gone wrong here? Okay, let's draw that. What could have gone wrong? And pretty soon you end up with an entirely different story because you ask the what could go wrong questions. All right. We might also add our objects into the plotting diagram. We might want to say, here is where the photos get used when we get the photos from Jimmy. Here, the draft, it gets written, but then we got to confirm with our sources and submit to Perry. The revisions come from the draft, so it is taking information from the draft and our notes. You might add objects in the plotting diagram, again, where it's helpful, where it might suggest Murphy points. What happens if the photos get lost? What happens if some part of the objects in your story can get damaged or stolen or spoiled? That all of a sudden suggests Murphy points. So in between Superman writing the draft and confirming it with his sources, what if Mr. Mxyzptlk, the mischievous imp, comes along? Yes, I said that name right the first time. I'm a little shocked. What if he comes along and changes the contents of the draft magically to become a story about the unicorns rampaging through Africa? Okay, that just became a whole new Murphy point because all of a sudden the story that Perry gets is complete garbage, and now Clark has to figure out where the story came from and try to recreate the original and get it back to Perry while the mischievous fifth dimensional imp is changing it every time he writes it. Whole different story. Again, where it's useful, not mandatory, don't go overboard. Other questions on the plotting diagram? All right. I want to
I
talk
have a question.
about, yeah.
You said that you used Tool to create yours rather than using sticky notes.
Yep.
Where do you get that? What is that?
There are a number of tools out there that are fairly easy to get a hold of. I happen to use, because I'm a software developer, I use a high-end tool for software development called Enterprise Architect. And if you're a programmer, it is well worth, I think it's like $300. It's well worth it for that. I wouldn't spend that as a writer. But there are lots of plotting, diagramming tools out there these days that are relatively inexpensive, sometimes free for small operator use. One is called Miro. That's what we use, Miro. We use that at my company. But there are lots of ones out there. And before this series is done, I'm going to try to put together a tool list. But I would look at Miro. I think that Miro licenses for small use are free.
Okay.
And Miro doesn't understand that. One of the reasons why I love Enterprise Architect is it is a tool for unified modeling language, which my story modeling language is built on that. So my tool specifically understands how to draw these pictures. Miro understands how to draw any picture you could possibly imagine, which might not give you guidance to stick within the structure that I'm trying to teach. But you know what? If you draw pictures and they help you solve problems, I don't care if you're following my guidance. So if Miro helps you draw pictures that don't look anything like what I would draw, but they help you solve problems in your story, you win.
I'm a developer as well, and I don't have your enterprise tool, but we have Visio. Would that be something you could recommend?
Ooh, we could talk a long time on Visio. I have not used Visio in probably 15 years, so I don't know what Visio is like today. When I was using Visio 15 years ago, it was good in a lot of ways, but it had one fatal flaw from my point of view. I was talking about everything diagrams and how you'd want to take a diagram, break it up in smaller diagrams, and so on. You might have the same things appearing in different diagrams. With my tool, if I were to change the name Superman to Clark Kent on one diagram, it becomes Clark Kent on every diagram. With
Yeah, I
Visio,
don't think Visio
you have
does
to
that.
change it every one.
Yeah.
So, but that's a small issue. It's not a zero issue, but it's a small issue. Visio, I have done very good modeling diagrams with Visio. I'm just spoiled by the higher end tool, but again, I paid for the higher end tool. Okay, full disclosure, I paid for a higher end tool when it cost like $180, and that was version 9 or so. And then I created this presentation and shared it with the manufacturer of my tool to say, here's an example of how somebody's using your tool in really, really different ways from anything you're doing. And I think it make a really cool case study. And they said, here's a license for version 17, which is the $300 one. And is obviously it's almost 10 years newer. So I did not pay the 300 for my job, for my purposes. I think it's justified $300 cost. I think they're providing $300 of value. I just don't know if it's $300 of value to a writer. But for a developer, I felt like it was worth it, especially since I didn't have to pay it.
Fair
But I
enough.
paid
Thank you.
180. Sorry, what?
No, fair enough. Thank you so much.
Yep. All right. Now, another form of a plotting diagram is really the same form, but we're going to call it a lane diagram because we break out the diagram across lanes. So the lanes represent things in the system, some things in the story where places happen or people who do things. You might have it be people, it might be groups, it might be robots, whatever. It helps you coordinate and also lets you start thinking of possible Murphy points. So here's our original diagram. Superman has a lane for Superman. Wants to submit a story. He's going to check with sources, so we need to go to the source lane because he has to talk to the sources. And then we're sending Jimmy out, so that's Jimmy looking for photos. And then Superman, back in his lane, writes the draft. Go now to the confirm with sources lane in their source lane. And then we get our photos from Jimmy back in his lane. We submit to Perry. Perry sends back the revision notes back to Superman's lane and sending revisions to Perry. Now, it's interesting now to see who's doing what work, and it suggests possible Murphy points again. Because what happens to this diagram now if Perry gets kidnapped and goes missing? Oh, gee, we've got 2 Murphy points now. We can't submit to Perry, and we can't send revisions to Perry. What happens if Jimmy gets lost in the wilderness as he's trying to take the photos? All of a sudden, we've got two complications there. So you can take these steps within the diagram and lay them out across lanes to see where things happen. You could even try. I fear you'll find that way madness lies. But you can try to do the Murphy game on a lane diagram. So looking at all the ways things can go wrong, and you can try. And what I find is the diagram gets really complicated. When you try to look at all the alternate paths, all assigned to their lanes, you start finding that, boy, it is just hard to carry that out and make it legible. Whereas if we went back to this diagram and decided that this lower path from searching for the source and calling Bruce and fighting Luther and the goons and the old switcheroo, if we decided that was our path that we want to write, and then we put it onto a lane diagram, except we're going to need more lanes. We're going to need lanes for the goons and lanes for Luther and so on, lanes for Bruce. Taking that resulting diagram that we say, that looks good, and then looking for the lanes, we could start looking for, hey, but things could still go wrong. So yes, there's no notation reason why you can't mix the Murphy game with the lane diagrams. I just, from long experience, know that if you try to put too many options onto this diagram, it starts becoming hard to follow. On the other hand, if you work at it, you can produce a diagram which doesn't have necessarily a Murphy game played, but is a lot going on. So some of you will recognize this right away. Our left lane is the captain who's taking the sub out to sea, and notice an object that he creates as part of this, which is false orders. And so the sub and the crew have the false orders. They're going to follow the false mission. When they do, the U.S. attack sub and crew discover the sub. But this captain of this Soviet submarine is the best in the business, so they manage to break away. But in the meantime, they use sonar, because there's an object in the diagram, to discover the sub originally. This breaking away and so on, meanwhile, the false orders have been detected, and the Russian hunter sub and crew get deployed. And now the story jumps back to where the analyst, a guy by the name of Jack Ryan, though of course I haven't identified him on this diagram, the analyst is looking at the results and says, I think he's defecting. Meanwhile, a saboteur aboard the ship sabotages the drive, which makes it easier to detect the sub with the sonar. And so now the attack sub and crew are ready to chase down this Soviet sub. But before they do, the analyst arrives by helicopter to the attack sub and convinces them that this is a defection and you need to help it. Meanwhile, the captain of the original sub fakes a reactor overload, so his sub and crew have to surface and board a rescue frigate. While they're doing that, the analyst boards the sub, and the captain requests asylum. The attack sub's captain, over in his lane, says, yes, I will grant you and your people, your officers, the asylum. And meanwhile, the hunter sub and crew have caught up, and they launch Fire 1, the first torpedo, and the captain of the Soviet sub intercepts that torpedo. But then the saboteur tries to kill the captain. So now the captain and the analysts are hunting the saboteur, while in the meantime, the hunter sub and crew over in their lane all the way over fire their second torpedo. The saboteur shoots the captain, the analyst shoots the saboteur, and the sub crew for the Soviet sub and the attack sub combine their sonars to redirect and deflect the second torpedo so it goes off. And now the captain takes his sub and hides it in a river, and the analyst gets to go home to his wife and kids, and happy, happy day. This is the Hunt for Red October laid out as a line diagram. It is not the book. The book would need about a dozen more lanes at least. The book has got a lot more depth and lots of more stuff going on. This is what would fit within a 2-hour movie. This is, and you'll notice this is, I won't say hand drawn, but it was using a drawing tool. It wasn't using my modeling tool because this was part of my Ulterior Motive Lounge comic strip where I drew most of my diagrams by hand. But I wanted an example of a really, really complicated lane diagram. And at the last minute, I changed the background from glaring legal pad yellow to gray because I realized the legal pad yellow would probably burn out your retinas and maybe your screens. So this is an example where a lane diagram can help you think about where each piece of the action is happening and how it relates to the other pieces of the action. Questions on that? Okay. Okay, I just thought this was going to be a short one. Ha 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 ha. The last thing we want to talk about though is maps. And I'm going to show these because I'm inordinately proud that these are the maps from my third novel, The Last Campaign, maps of Maxwell City, the Martian city where the action happens. And I'm inordinately proud because after I wrote the book, my publisher came to me and said, could you sketch some maps so we can have the cartographer turn them into real maps? Because people are going to want to know where things are happening. And I'm, besides being a writer and a programmer, I'm a role-playing game master who has been building my own maps since 1979 and have got a mapping tool that's really good and built these maps. And my publisher looked at them and said, never mind, we don't need a cartographer, and they published my maps. And I'm just about as proud of having a published maps as I am of a published book, because I love drawing these. I do a lot better, but this needed to be fairly simplistic. So these are maps of different parts of Maxwell City. We have the main one in the upper left is the surface features, and then we have levels 1, 2, and 3, and then the services district at the very bottom. So these are places where the action happens in that book and in my subsequent novellas, Maxwell's Demons. They're all based on these maps. I probably should get the maps into those novellas as well. So the concept of a map is just locations within a story where things happen. They are ultimately just objects, just like any other object, but they are objects that are in particular places in geographic location. So where things happen, and just as important, how you travel from scene to scene. So if you need to get from Fort Hudson to the power plant, you're going to have to head through the Port Shannon Lopez, and everything beyond that, you're going to be going underground. Unless you're taking off across the surface of Mars, you're going to be going underground through various tunnels that are going to take you, but that's not part of this map. That's part of these maps. So you're going to end up going through the various parts, heading out to different parts of the outer city. So maps, very easy to grasp. You draw a map and okay, everybody gets it. It's really, really useful to understand where things are. They're cool. I love making maps, and it's a lot of work and time. And I'm not sure, unless you really need, you're doing a thriller with actual tactical battles taking place, I'm not sure you need this level of detail. What I think you need is a network map. And if you look really close, this is the exact same thing as those first maps we looked at. We have Maxwell City in the center, which is where everything happens. We have the power plant sticking off from it, which has within it an airlock to the surface and a garage. We have the crawler garage, which has an airlock. We have Port Shannon Lopez, which is the spaceport. And on the path between the port and Maxwell City is Fort Hudson. And within those are details. So Maxwell City has some garages. It has the admin tower. It has some airlocks. And then it has our 3 levels, 1, 2, 3, and then it has the services level. Within level 1, within the story, because obviously levels are a lot bigger, the places that within the story are on level 1 is the admin and the concourse that connects all the places, and Zeb's, which is the restaurant where many scenes happen. Within level 2, nothing. Not a thing. Nothing in this story happens in level 2. I'll get to that in some of the later ones, but for this one, nothing was there. Level 3, particularly, has Rosie and Nick's apartment, and it has the Aldrin City Embassy, which becomes a major plot point halfway through the book. And the services district, besides all the city services that are down there, has two very specific things that are connected to each other: the chapel for services and the tomb, which is where we recycle wastes, including human bodies. All of these elements, by putting them into this structure in the network map, where essentially pieces contained within pieces and how they connect, you're not having to focus on this, where you're trying to get every little last detail right. You're simply trying to understand how you get from place to place and how places are connected. So it's how many places you have. So we have multiple airlocks, we have multiple different garages, and what's contained within each. And it's simpler to draw. And because it's not a real map, you don't have the temptation to make it perfect. Because I spent way too long on those maps. I loved them, but I spent way too long on them. It was not productive per se. It was a labor of love. So your network map lets you draw an abstraction. And it might be a more realistic network map might be this, where now I'm taking every single place and drawing connecting lines, much like we did on our object diagrams, but this is simpler. Now, one other thing you can do on maps, and I don't have an example on here, but you can also mark the paths that connect point A to point B with information like how you do that trip, how long does it take. If your story requires in detail travel between places, then you might be marking down that, oh, from Shannon Lopez to Maxwell City, that's probably a 45-minute trip because you have to go through customs and you have to go through quarantine and you have to go through this and that. You might mark up the routes with travel information. Questions on the maps? All right. So that's going to wrap us up for this week. Our upcoming schedule. Next week is going to be Making Story Models Part 3, where we're going to look now at plot planning in terms of acts and inflection points and Vonnegut's fortune models and more. October 5, we're going to wrap up with other models that I don't use as often, but I want you exposed to them. The 12th, we'll be doing another one of my tribute episodes, Kevin J. Anderson and Rebecca Mesta, talking about two of my mentors that I've learned so much from. The 19th, we're going to be digging into the science, free fall and spin gravity. 26th, marketing for introverts. We will have on the 2nd, whose story isn't anyway, improv lessons, and then look at openings on the 9th, and story strategies, choices you will make on the 16th. Orbits and transfers on the 23rd, and November 30th will be a tribute to probably my favorite author today, Jack McDevitt, who has not been a teacher at any of the things I've been at. So pulling his lessons out has been a little harder. I've had to do a little more researching. Gosh darn it, I've had to read more of Jack's books again. I just don't know how I ever survived having to read Jack's books, because it's been 7 or 8 months since the last time I read Jack's book, so it's a little early. I usually read them about once a year. Questions on the schedule? All right, again, these are the books I'm promoting for this week. I did see some questions in the chat, so come on. Where are questions in the chat? All right. Yes, Dinah saying purchase Family Secrets model. Already own Making Story Models. Thank you. Anne Marie sending you the link. Not Dinah. Dina. I will learn eventually. Feel free to mock me when I get it wrong.
It's all good. I've been called all kinds of things.
Yeah, I understand. It takes a little while. And looks like Dave said I did a good description of double versus single stack. I owe that entirely to Larry Niven, or not Larry Nivens, Larry Correa's fans on Monster Hunter International, because they get into great detail on gun topics, and I try my best to struggle along. Yes, the tool I use, again, Enterprise Architect, but again, Miro and other such ones should be good. Visio should be good. All right. Any last questions? All right. And it was actually a little over the hour. I honestly thought this was going to be short. Next week's going to be long. I guarantee you next week's going to be long. But this is what we have, and this is another step in the modeling process. And I hope you can find some use in it, practice it, see where it helps you solve problems. And I will end our recording and wish you all well.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you so much.